Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into a book that completely, and I mean completely, shatters how we think about mental health and society. We're talking about Michel Foucault's absolute game changer, Madness and Civilization. You know, we usually like to think that our modern medical approach to mental illness is just, well, a natural evolution of pure science, right? But Foucault, he argues something way more provocative. He shows us that the way we actually define and treat madness is entirely a social construct. It's an idea heavily influenced by economics, morality, and just a desperate need for social order. There's this fantastic quote by Pascal that hits the nail on the head and perfectly frames our journey today. Men are so necessarily mad that not to be mad would amount to another form of madness. Notice how he uses that word mad. He's essentially suggesting that society actually had to invent the concept of madness just to figure out what reason even was. Before science stepped in to neatly categorize the human mind, madness was this fluid, deeply complex social phenomenon. And Foucault wants us to return to that 0 point, right before reason and madness got totally divorced, to see exactly how that dividing line was drawn. So, to keep us on track, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the void of leprosy. Then, the ship of fools. Next, madness as moral failing. After that, the great confinement. And we'll wrap up with the ethic of labor. Let's get right into it. To keep us totally grounded, we're going to trace 3 big historical eras. We'll move from the Middle Ages, right between the 1200s and 1400s, straight into the vibrant 1500s of the Renaissance, and finally land with a massive societal thud in the year 1656, which kicks off what Foucault calls the Classical Age.
All right, part 1, the void of leprosy.
Try to wrap your head around this number. 19,000. That's how many leprosariums existed across Christendom, including 43 in the Diocese of Paris alone, that just abruptly emptied out between 1200 and 1400. 19,000. These massive physical structures, places like Saint-Germain and Saint-Lazare, were just suddenly vacant. And actually, this disappearance wasn't necessarily because of some massive medical breakthrough. It was likely the result of really strict segregation and the cutting off of Eastern infection routes after the Crusades. But here is the crazy part. While the disease itself faded away, the physical structures, and more importantly, the psychological habit of excluding people, remained completely intact. Now, check out this contrast because it's wild. Back in the day, the leper was pushed physically outside the city gates, sure, but they were actually spiritually integrated into society. They were seen as a manifestation of God's grace. Giving to them was basically a way for the healthy to earn their own salvation. But with leprosy gone, society suddenly needed a brand new scapegoat to fill those empty physical and psychological spaces. And when madness eventually takes over those empty spaces, the script flips entirely. The madman isn't seen as a sacred witness to God's will. Oh no, they become morally condemned. But, as we'll see, that transition didn't happen overnight. Which brings us to part 2, the ship of fools. Okay, you honestly won't believe this, but this was a real historical reality. German municipalities literally paid sailors to just take madmen away. It sounds like something straight out of a myth, right? But the ship of fools, or the Narren ship, was completely real. Towns would routinely drive the insane right outside their city limits. In places like Nuremberg or Frankfurt, authorities would hand these supposedly bothersome books over to boatmen and essentially say, good luck. It was a highly symbolic act. You see, water, in the minds of Renaissance Europeans, carried things away and purified them. It essentially delivered a person to the absolute uncertainty of fate. Foucault captures this beautifully when he calls the madman the passenger par excellence, that is, the prisoner of the passage. It's just deeply tragic when you really think about it. The madman is confined, but his prison is literally the most open route in the world, the open sea or a rushing river. He is placed on the inside of the outside, forever navigating between 2 worlds, right? He's a prisoner of the passage itself, basically bearing a strange, unsettling truth that everyday city dwellers just didn't want to look at too closely. Moving right along to part 3, madness as moral failing. So, watch how this perception completely transforms over time. First, back in the 15th century, you had painters like Hieronymus Bosch depicting madness as this dark, apocalyptic threat, like a literal cosmic invasion. But shortly after that, writers like Erasmus kind of tamed it. They turned it into a moral satire of everyday human weakness, using it to tackle things like pride, greed, and vanity. And finally, step 3, it just became a dramatic literary device for heavyweights like Shakespeare and Cervantes, a clever way to reveal the hidden truth beneath our illusions. Madness basically lost its cosmic terror and became a recognizable, albeit tragic, part of human nature. It was no longer roaming the physical edges of the world. It was anchored firmly to mankind. That perfectly sets the stage for Part 4, the Great Confinement. Now, when you hear the word hospital, you probably think of doctors, nurses, and medicine, right? Well, scratch that. The Hopital General was absolutely not what you might think. When the king decreed its creation in 1656 in Paris, it wasn't to cure the sick. No way. It was essentially a penal structure designed from the ground up to enforce bourgeois monarchical order. It acted as a third order of repression, sitting right there between the police and the courts. Get this. The directors had stakes, irons, and literal dungeons at their disposal. They had the power to judge and punish without any right of appeal. And this terrifying model spread like wildfire all across Europe, from the Zuchthasern in Germany to the workhouses over in England. Literally almost overnight, 6,000 people got swept up into this facility. That was a full 1% of the entire population of Paris. And just look at who they targeted. Unemployed workers, impoverished students, disbanded soldiers, all lumped right in there with the sick and the insane. The archers of the Hopital literally hunted down beggars in the streets. If you were without resources, without social moorings, or just frankly unable to fit into the new economic structure, boom, you were locked up. And this is exactly where the insane found their new, permanent home. Not in some caring medical ward, but in stone cells right alongside debtors and vagabonds. And that brings us to our final piece of the puzzle, Part 5, the ethic of labor. So why did they actually do this? Well, it turns out this massive wave of confinement was a direct response to a 17th century economic crisis. It was basically a super crude tool used to regulate the labor market. Think about this dynamic. During periods of full employment, these institutions acted like factories, providing incredibly cheap forced labor to maximize profits. But during times of unemployment, when there was no work and wages were tanking, they functioned as a giant broom to sweep the idle off the streets. It prevented riots and literally erased the visual of poverty from the city entirely. What's really fascinating here is how economic necessity was completely disguised as moral reform. Suddenly, idleness was framed as a literal rebellion against God. Labor wasn't just a basic economic transaction anymore, it became a strict moral imperative. Inmates at places like Psychiatry were forced to perform completely pointless, grueling tasks. I mean, they were sometimes literally acting as human horses to turn a massive water wheel. And this was all just to punish them for the so-called sin of sloth. It had absolutely nothing to do with genuine productivity. It was just an exercise in pure moral constraint and physical exhaustion. So if we boil it all down, this brings us to the core reason why the insane were locked up next to criminals. It wasn't to cure them, not at all. It was simply because their condition prevented them from participating in this strict new ethic of labor. Because they couldn't conform to the rhythms of collective work, society just labeled them as socially useless. They were alienated from this new community of labor, a community that had suddenly gained the ethical power to segregate anyone who didn't contribute. The madman wasn't locked up because he was sick. He was locked up because he was idle. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty big question. Foucault shows us that the line between reason and unreason was drawn by economic anxiety and the brutal demands of a shifting labor market. So, have we really moved past the Great Confinement today? Or do we still fundamentally link a human being's intrinsic baseline value to their economic productivity? Have we maybe just built different kinds of walls? It's a fascinating question for sure, and one that absolutely forces us to look a lot more closely at the systems we just take for granted every single day. Thanks for joining me on this one.